Good evening, everybody. I'm Brigitte van Rijmberg, the editor-in-chief and history editor at Princeton University Press. It is my great pleasure and honor to welcome you to the first of Ian Buruma's three-part Princeton public lectures titled No Divine Right, Religion and Democracy on Three Continents. These lectures will discuss the clash or tension between religion and secularism in modern democracies, and the three continents Ian Buruma is referring to are Europe, America, and Asia. The three lectures are part of the Stafford Little Lectures, and they're jointly sponsored by the Princeton Public Lecture Committee and Princeton University Press, and we will be very proud to publish them as a little trade book very soon. The Stafford Little Lectures were founded in 1899 with a gift by Henry Stafford Little of the class of 1844, who was a lawyer and the first president of the New York and Long Branch Railroad Company. The lectures have included Theodore Roosevelt on national strength and international duty, 1917, Albert Einstein on the meaning of relativity, 1920, which the press published, by the way, and which is still selling marvelously well, as you can imagine. Henry Stimson on democracy and nationalism in Europe, 1933, Arnold Schoenberg on 12-tone music composition, Thurgood Marshall on the constitutional rights of the Negro in 1963, and Gunnar Myrdal on the racial crisis in the United States in historical perspective, 1969. As you will have to admit, Ian Buruma joins an illustrious line of speakers here. Before I let Gary Bass, professor of politics and international affairs and the author most recently of Freedom's Battle, The Origins of Humanitarian Intervention, introduce Ian Buruma, let me just mention two upcoming Princeton public lectures. Walter Isaacson from the Aspen Institute will lecture on Einstein, Franklin, and the role of creativity in today's world on November 18th in McCosh. And Andrew Del Banco from Columbia University will address the question, does college really matter? The latter is again a three-lecture deal sponsored by the Princeton Public Lecture Committee and Princeton University Press and will be published as a little book. And those lectures are on December 1st, 2nd, and 3rd. Ian Buruma will lecture for about 50 minutes and then we'll open the podium up for questions and answers. And I hand over the podium to Gary Bassner to introduce Ian Buruma.
Good evening. There was a 19th century Central European custom of introducing people at balls and at fancy social affairs with their name and with their languages as a proper measure of their learning and their erudition. So it's my pleasure to introduce to you Ian Buruma, English, Chinese, Dutch, French, German, and Japanese. That actually rather astonishing list of 6 European and East Asian languages gives you some sense of the breadth of Ian Buruma's scope. Bard College had its work cut out for it, trying to find a title with an appropriate sense of gravitas, but came up with one that is actually pretty good. He is the Henry R. Luce Professor of Democracy, Human Rights, and Journalism. Ian Buruma has the kind of biography that makes you realize not only how unproductive you are, but also how boring you are. He studied Chinese literature and history at Leiden in his native Holland, and then Japanese cinema at Nihon University in Tokyo. He spent much of the 1970s in Tokyo as variously an actor, a buto dancer, a photographer, and a documentary filmmaker. He then proceeded on to a brilliant career in journalism, reporting from all across Asia, and finally winding up as the cultural editor of the Far Eastern Economic Review, and then the foreign editor of The Spectator in London. It would actually be more efficient to list the publications that he hasn't written for than the ones that he has, but he writes regularly for the New Yorker, the New York Review of Books, the New York Times, the FT, and many, many more. Ian Buruma is the author of a dozen books, literally, as well as one book of photographs of Japanese tattoos. And just to prove that he can do anything, his latest book, The China Lover, just out from Penguin, is a novel. The astonishing breadth of his nonfiction subjects include Japanese cultural heroes, European Anglomania, Chinese rebels and dissidents, The Rise of Modern Japan, and The Murder of Theo van Gogh. This would essentially be unforgivable even if the books were terrible, but they're not. They're uniformly wonderful. And the hallmark of two of my favorite Ian Buruma books, The Wages of Guilt and Occidentalism, the hallmark of them is the comparative analysis of radically different cultures. That in Occidentalism he finds a common intellectual thread that connects World War II Japanese anxieties about westernization and modernization with some similar anxieties in the hands of German romantics in the 18th and 19th centuries, Pan-Slavists and Slavophiles in Russia in the 19th century, and Islamists of various stripes in Syria and Iran. It takes an extraordinary gift to cover so much with such complexity, that it is not polemic. It is not a sense that there are all these people out there who hate the West and they're all the same. It's exactly the opposite of that, that he, incredibly respectful, incredibly understanding, getting inside of these different cultural strands, not reducing them to a common undifferentiated enemy, but trying to really help us to understand these places and these ideas that may be complex and unfamiliar to us, if not to him. In The Wages of Guilt, he brilliantly compares how Germans and Japanese have wrestled with their dark wartime pasts. And he argues that the frightening currents that drew many Japanese to the German model before World War I, things like Prussian authoritarianism, a sort of romantic nationalism, an ostensibly scientific kind of racism, became anathema in Germany while lingering in post-war Japan. That there are only a tiny handful of people on the planet who could produce these kinds of works of magnificent synthesis across not one, not two, but three continents. And we're therefore extraordinarily lucky to have with us tonight Ian Buruma. So, Ian.
Thank you very much for that very kind introduction. I should perhaps mention that Occidentalism, it certainly has a lot of breadth, but it wasn't all mine. My co-author, Avishai Margalit, who is now professor at Princeton, was responsible for some of that. Anyway, thank you very much for inviting me for this very great honor of delivering these lectures. I'm going to do it in three parts, as has already been mentioned. The first part is a comparison between Europe and the United States and why the histories of the separation of religious and secular authority seems to be so different in the old world and the new world. And perhaps some of it will be a little bit too familiar to you because it involves the United States. The second one next week will be about how the same problems really exist in Japan and China as a kind of riposte to those who argue that these problems of secular and religious authority are really a problem of monotheistic societies, and that in polytheistic societies they don't really exist. They seem to have handled these things much better. Which I contest. And the third one will be about the tensions that have arisen because of the presence of large numbers of Muslim immigrants in Europe and in the West in general, and especially the political extremism that has come out of the Islamic world. Before I begin, I should perhaps lay my own cards on the table. I don't really have any religious axes to grind myself, since I had no religious education or upbringing whatsoever. I'm not quite sure whether that's a curse or a blessing. I suppose it's a blessing, since I never had to overcome education by nuns or priests or any of that sort. On the other hand, where would the great art of Federico Fellini and Luis Buñuel and so on be without having gone through that kind of process? And also what I feel myself quite profoundly is a sense of ignorance when it comes to religious ritual and so on, which I do think in some ways is a drawback. My family background, just to put you in the picture, my father was the son of a Mennonite minister, and the Mennonites in the Netherlands are very different animals than they are in the United States. It's the most sort of ecumenical, liberal, leftist even form of Protestantism. And so when my grandfather was visited by bearded figures from the United States in sort of black suits in the 1920s and 30s, this was often very awkward for him. But my father reacted as most sons, or many sons of clerics do, and became a lifelong atheist. My mother comes from a very assimilated Anglo-German Jewish family, and I think I'm quoting Adam Gopnik, whom I don't often quote in public lectures here. The Jewishness of my mother's family manifested itself in the enthusiasm with which they celebrated Christmas. We had to have bigger Christmas trees, more lavish Christmas lunches, bigger presents than the Goyim, and so on. So no religion in my background. And with that I shall start. Elmer Gantry was drunk. He was eloquently drunk, lovingly and pugnaciously drunk. So goes the beginning of Sinclair Lewis's novel about the evangelical preacher Elmer Gantry, a great American character, boundless in his greed, a sinner obsessed with the devil, a salesman of astonishing energy who believes in the greater good of his own success, a man of great charm and destructive power. It is difficult to imagine Gantry as a European. He is too capacious, too full of enthusiasm, too careless about fate, class, and convention. In short, Elmer Hellcat Gantry is way too optimistic to be anything but a full-blooded American. Lewis wrote his book as an indictment of American evangelical fervor. We're not supposed to admire Gantry. Indeed, we should fear him, and the people who believe in hustlers like him. And yet, especially in the movie version, with the magnificent Burt Lancaster, it is difficult not to admire Gantry a little, or even to like him. Playing on people's fear of death, the main source of his power, the preacher, like the culture that spawned him, is brimming with vitality. The successful evangelical preacher combines a talent for showmanship, business acumen, and a plausible air of sincerity. Scholarship is a drawback in this line of work. Learning, if acquired at all, should be disguised. The point is to be a man of the people, a regular guy, and not some slick, stuck-up, college-educated snob who thinks he's better than we are. Gantry is a sinner, a drunken adulterer who is constantly on the brink of disaster, his sordid affairs exposed by the press, but somehow he always manages to redeem himself in the eyes of his flock. He goes down on his knees in the church or prayer tent, and here I quote directly from Lewis, "Oh, my friends," he cries, "do you believe in my innocence, in the fiendishness of my accusers? Reassure me with a hallelujah." The church thundered with a triumphant hallelujah, and in a sacred silence Elmer prayed, "Dear Lord, thy work is but begun. We shall yet make these United States a moral nation." And he said this while ogling the pretty ankles of a girl in the choir, which makes it quite clear that his sins will never be entirely redeemed. Sinclair Lewis is not a subtle novelist. His message leaves no room for ambiguity. Yet Elmer Gantry is an unforgettable character who seems like a crude caricature until one has seen his real-life colleagues on television. Examples of contemporary Gantrys are not confined to the evangelical stages. They appear in all their pomp at political party conventions in election years. Ronald Reagan had some of Gantry in him, even though he was not very religious. So had Bill Clinton. And despite his lack of natural charisma, George W. Bush, a man who exemplified to many Americans the hard road from sin to redemption. McCain, I don't think, has much of Gantry. Sarah Palin, of course, has it in spades. Obama, in his way, has a bit, but his tradition, of course, comes from the black gospel, so he's had to tone it down. But he can do it. He can turn it on when he wants to. The difference between selling the gospel, a car, or a political candidate is not always obvious in the United States. For all mix show business with popular sentiment, the reassuring air of the regular guy and the braggadocio of the carnival huckster. When Europeans watch American television, they're often astonished by the money-grubbing crassness of the present-day Elmer Gantries, the vulgarity of the howling, sweating televangelists, and the primitive notion of America as a land blessed by God, a city on the hill, inhabited by a chosen people, glassy-eyed in polyester suits. It is easy to forget that revivalism actually began in Europe, as did the idea of God-chosen nations. To Dutch Protestants rebelling against Catholic Spain in the 16th century and 17th century, their republic was the New Zion. German pietists in the 17th century and English Methodists, Shakers, and other dissenters in the 18th century preached that every man had his own pipeline to the Lord, and salvation did not come from membership of established churches or need the mediation of official clerics. However, even though the roots of American evangelical faith are in Europe, and Europeans were the first to spread the good word, it really came into its own into the New World. In the mid-19th century, the established Anglican and Congregationalist churches of the early colonists had already been overtaken by Baptists, Methodists, Presbyterians, and other sectarians roaming the land of cabins and prayer meetings. They were followed by Pentecostalists, Restorationists, and charismatic healers, dancing and jerking and speaking in tongues, while attendance at the old churches were shrinking all the time. The trend has continued to this day. A Gallup poll found that 43 to 46% of Americans think of themselves as born-again Christians. 77% of American Christians believe in hell. Meanwhile, in France, a largely Catholic country, less than 20% even bother to attend Mass. This is why more and more liberal Europeans sneer at America. Evangelical zeal has to be the result of deep ignorance, cultural emptiness, and an addiction to celebrity and primitive pizzazz. But there is another explanation for the success of popular faith, which throws a less negative light on the American scene. Today, the so-called religious right is seen by liberals, American and European, as a threat to democracy. But not all evangelical believers are right-wing, and the peculiar forms that Christian faith has taken in the United States are in fact closely linked to American democracy. Alexis de Tocqueville, an aristocrat who celebrated the birth of democracy while fearing some of its consequences, traveled in America during the Second Great Awakening, when Mormons, Seventh-day Adventists, and Jehovah's Witnesses headed for the western frontier. Two things struck him about the religious atmosphere he encountered. One was the devotion to liberty. This in contrast to Europe. In France, wrote Tocqueville, I quote, I had seen the spirits of religion and of freedom almost always marching in opposite directions. In America, I found them intimately linked together in joint reign over the same land. Unquote. The reason why Americans were so religious, while in Europe the churches were under attack, to Tocqueville's evident dismay, because he was, after all, a Catholic believer, was the complete separation in the United States of church and state. Americans felt that they could believe freely, not just because religious freedom was protected by the Constitution, but because religious authority was not in the hands of worldly politicians. Again, Tocqueville points out the difference with Europe in one of the most important passages of Democracy in America. Quote, unbelievers in Europe attack Christians more as political than as religious enemies. They hate faith as the opinion of a party much more than as a mistaken belief. And they reject the clergy less because they are the representatives of God than because they are the friends of authority. Unquote. The Great Awakenings, all the barking and swooning and fainting notwithstanding, were an assault on the authority of established churches as much as French Jacobinism was, even though it was considerably less violent. Both attacks, in their different ways, were fruits of the Enlightenment, even though this would not be immediately obvious to everyone in the American case. Jefferson was a man of the Enlightenment, a Francophile, an aristocrat who believed passionately in reason. He was most probably less religious than Tocqueville, but in regards to religious freedom, his cause was the same as that of the Restorationists, the New Lights Congregationalists, and other Protestants of the Great Awakening, who believed that men could be born again through God's grace and held no truck with the hierarchy of old world churches. Jefferson may have had nothing much in common with the charismatic holy rollers and fire and brimstone preachers of Georgia or upstate New York, but when it came to their freedom to believe whatever they wanted, in any way they wanted, he was entirely on their side. Now, one should not, of course, be too starry-eyed about American freedom and democracy. It had great limits, and in Jefferson's time, the limits were mainly confined to those who were not in slavery. And some of the great preachers of the time, some of the Europeans, preached to slaves, but were still in favor of the system. So one should, and this was something that many Europeans at the time noted when they were preached to by Americans on the superiority of the American system. Even as the First Great Awakening was taking place in the United States, in the middle of the 18th century, David Hume wrote his essay Of Superstition and Enthusiasm. Hume, like Spinoza a century earlier, had little respect for any form of religion. All religion is false, as he put it, but he made some interesting distinctions and was more inclined than Spinoza to recognize the importance of religious institutions. There were two kinds of believers, in his view, the superstitious and the enthusiasts. The former tend to be fearful, melancholy, even abject, and thus much too timorous to approach the divinity by themselves. This is why, in Hume's words, superstition is favorable to priestly power. Tocqueville, good Catholic though he was, appeared to have agreed. And he observed, of course, that even the Catholics in the United States were behaving more and more like Protestants. And he also observed that this might not have been the case if they'd been a majority rather than a vulnerable minority. Enthusiasts, on the other hand, are drawn to irrationality by a surfeit of self-confidence. While the superstitious turn anxiously to churchly authority for mediation between man and God, enthusiasts, and here I quote Hume, have been free from the yoke of ecclesiastics and have expressed great independence of devotion with a contempt of forms, ceremonies, and traditions, unquote. As typical examples of religious fanaticism, Hume mentions the early Quakers in England, followed by the Presbyterians, the Anabaptists in Germany, and the Camisards in France. But fanaticism, Hume observes, is hard to sustain for very long. And so he concludes, quote, religions which partake of enthusiasm are on their first rise more furious and violent than those which partake of superstition, but in a little time become more gentle and moderate. Now, he may not have been entirely right about this. Certainly, if you look at modern American history, it is the causes started by a belief that they are willed by God are by no means always gentle. But one understands what he means. Like Hobbes and Spinoza before him, Hume was concerned about taming the violent passions of religious believers, as well as stopping religious irrationality from interfering with rational inquiry. Hume also believed that once the violent stage was over, a more liberal Protestant version of Christianity could contribute to political liberty. But only if the wild, intolerant, and superstitious elements of religion were firmly kept in check. He was a great believer in institutions, including the established church. The Anglican Church was necessary, in his view, for the stability of English society, and this included the civil liberties which the English people were fortunate enough to enjoy. Hume's conservatism was a typical example of English compromise. An agnostic on miracles and deeply suspicious of all clerics, Hume did not accept that morality was God-given. But reason was not enough to explain everything. Nature and human life were too full of mysteries. And if morality could not be based entirely on human reason, nor could political institutions, in Hume's view, in extreme cases, people were entitled to rebel against a tyrant, but the people could no more choose their system of government than their native languages or cultural habits. I remember, by the way, once interviewing the conservative British politician Enoch Powell about this very thing, when he explained to me that people should never rebel against their government. And I put it to him that, what about if you were German in the 1930s and early 40s? And he said some people are simply luckier than others, which I think was slightly dodging the issue. But, political legitimacy was neither divinely ordained nor a matter of popular sovereignty, and this is Hume, but of tradition, history, sentiment, prejudice, and institutions grown over time. Precisely because he was a man of the Enlightenment, Hume was convinced that nothing could be known absolutely. That is why man needs custom and tradition to guide him. This is the basis of British mixed government, of anchoring society in the established church, the aristocracy, the monarchy, and an elected parliament. Not because God willed it so, but because man needs it. Hobbes and Spinoza were more radical. Since morality is not determined by a higher being, men in the state of nature, as conceived by Hobbes, are ruled by their desires, their fears, and their ignorance. Religious strife occurs because men in their dark ignorance will follow priests, prophets, and seers who promote competing metaphysical recipes to ease their fears. The only way for man to be delivered from the brutal state of nature and the dangerous blandishments of religious Pied Pipers was to have a political system ruled by an enlightened tyrant. Spinoza took a similar view of the state of nature, but came to a different political conclusion. In Spinoza's state of nature, it is every man for himself. There is no such thing as good or bad, whether or not divinely decreed. Survival is all that matters, and no one can feel safe in a state where all is permitted and everyone is a potential enemy. Cooperation, alliances, laws, society are necessary conditions for, as Spinoza put it, supporting life and cultivating the mind. However, unlike Hobbes, Spinoza did not favor a tyrannical form of dominion, nor an aristocratic one, nor even a mixed one, like Hume, but a democracy, by which he meant something reasonably close to what we understand by that term today. This is Spinoza. For all who are born of citizen parents, or on the soil of the country, who have deserved well of the Republic, or have accomplished any other conditions upon which the law grants to a man right of citizenship, they all, I say, have a right to demand for themselves the right to vote in the Supreme Council and to fill public offices, nor can they be refused it, but for crime or infamy. Unquote, which is a remarkably progressive statement even today, where not all people would subscribe to this. The eminent Princeton historian Jonathan Israel has made a strong case that the radical early Enlightenment of Spinoza was the truly democratic one. Later Enlightenment thinkers, such as Hume and Locke, watered down the intellectual achievements of the 17th century radicals by making too many compromises in terms of class privileges as well as organized faith. Spinoza really did think that everyone should be free to believe or not believe whatever he wished, as long as he did not break the law or cause harm to others. Locke, on the other hand, barely tolerated Catholics, was suspicious of Jews, and did not tolerate atheists at all. From Israel's keenly Spinozist point perspective, the mixed governments of the British and Dutch monarchies, one with an established church protected by the sovereign, and the other with a plethora of church-affiliated political parties, are the diminished heirs of the compromised late Enlightenment. They are better than tyrannies, to be sure, but not as good as they ought to have been, and certainly not as good as received Anglo-Saxon opinion thinks they are. The French Republic had higher ideals, more in line with the early Enlightenment, which was the source, Israel writes, quote, of the strand of republicanism which developed ultimately into Jacobinism and attempted after 1789 to eradicate monarchy, social hierarchy, and ecclesiastical power by means of revolution. Unquote. The link is clearly there, even though Spinoza was not as dogmatic as the Jacobins, either about politics or religion. But there's no doubt that the French Revolution crushed organized religion and paved the way for political arrangements that were more secularist. And I mean by secularist not simply the state of separation between church and state, but actually a dogma of secularism, which is by no means the same thing. The question is whether these arrangements in France were also more democratic or liberal democratic than the mixed governments of other European states. In 1989, that fateful year of democratic revolts against communist tyranny, François Mitterrand, as President of France, invited his fellow European leaders to celebrate the bicentenary of the French Revolution. Forgetting for a moment Robespierre and the Terror, the French Revolution, and especially the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, Robespierre and the Terror, the French Revolution, and especially the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, as proclaimed in the National Assembly in April 1789, were officially presented as the quasi-sacred sources of democratic freedom in the world. Only Margaret Thatcher, one of the official guests, tried to put a damper on the joyful mood by pointing out that British freedoms owed nothing to France and everything to the Magna Carta. Writing brilliantly about the occasion in the New York Review of Books, the Irish intellectual Conor Cruise O'Brien made a similar point more amusingly. First of all, he observed, the French Revolution owed a great deal to English and especially American thinkers. Voltaire, Montesquieu, and even Rousseau, until he changed his mind, were admirers of British and American liberties. John Locke was one of Voltaire's idols. One of the most moving scenes in Voltaire's biography is when he was on his deathbed and George Washington came to visit him. And Voltaire blessed George Washington's son by passing his hand over his head and saying, "For God and democracy," and he said it in English. Strange episode. O'Brien also points out the roles played by Lafayette and Thomas Jefferson, who was the US ambassador in Paris during the Revolution, as you know. Alas, in O'Brien's account, the French ended up forsaking the moderating influence of Locke, Lafayette, and Jefferson, and opted for a kind of status absolutism instead. Borrowing from Spinoza's idea of the secular state as an embodiment of the general will or common good, Rousseau wrote his Social Contract in 1762. It was an attempt to devise a blueprint for a society where the sovereign people were as equal and free as in the state of nature, while abiding by the laws that express the general will. The substance of this general will, which was supposed to be infallible, like the most despotic Catholic popes, was not entirely clear. It would have to involve some form of religion, a civil religion, in Rousseau's words, that transcended individual interests and bound the citizens together. Rousseau unlike some of his radical predecessors, believed that when people have to cooperate, they need faith, albeit not one derived from the authority of a church, and the general will would have to be imposed by force. To dissent from the will of the people was to be an enemy or a traitor. That is how Robespierre saw the enemies of the people. As he put it, our will is the general will. It was as if the rebels against absolute monarchy in the Catholic Church had replaced one kind of absolutism with another. One of the great differences between France and Britain, or indeed the United States really, is the role of the Catholic Church. As Tocqueville pointed out, European unbelievers attacked Christians more as political than as religious enemies. He was certainly right about France. The Catholic Church was an extremely powerful political institution with vast wealth in land and treasure. The Vatican was a source of absolute truth, and the authority of priests was almost total. The despotic monarchy of France was intimately linked to the Church. That is why the Jacobins had to destroy both. Even though Louis XVI was in fact far from despotic, they needed to crush the monarchy and purge religion from the public realm to put the secular republic out of the Church's reach. Civil religion is a product of the democratic revolutions, both in the United States and France. What they have in common is their claim to universal validity, like Christianity or indeed Islam. The Napoleonic conquests, no less than the American idea of manifest destiny, were justified by the universalist claim of spreading rationalist ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity. French republicanism, in the minds of its promoters, could and indeed should be applied everywhere, which is, of course, why the French and the Americans have so often been at loggerheads, the two Western democracies, to have this universalist idea of their own destiny. To this idea, boosters of the American destiny believe in similar ideals. But in the American case, the secularist idealism of the Founding Fathers has been complicated by the assertion among Christian believers that the nation's destiny is guided by higher powers. Since such metaphysical assertions can still be heard in the United States, Europeans are inclined to agree with the American essentialists that this reflects a uniquely American phenomenon. This too, however, is an error. Similar claims have been made by Protestants in other Western democracies, including, or indeed especially, in Spinoza's native country, the Netherlands. The politics of the great Dutch statesman Abraham Kuyper, 1837-1920, a name possibly not known to all of you, but apparently still a hero to some circles of the religious right in the United States. He was but one example of an attempt all over Europe in the mid-19th century to claw back the European destiny from Enlightenment liberalism. His political party, which he led for many years as a cabinet minister and prime minister, was called the Anti-Revolutionary Party. The revolution it opposed was, of course, the French one. In many ways, Kuyper was very much like his populist Christian American counterparts. His distrust of the liberal educated elite was such that he did not consider them to be part of the Dutch Volk. The spirit of Erasmus, Grotius, and Spinoza, in his view, had alienated the Dutch from their Christian roots. Those, as he put it, deniers of Christ, those, again his words, self-satisfied thinkers, may be more learned than the common believer, whom Kuyper championed, but they were divorced from the stream of national life. Again, these are words that will be familiar to anybody who's been following the current presidential campaign. This is also why he distrusted central government, run by city slickers. The real people lived in small towns. The truest national culture was provincial. What Kuyper's anti-revolutionaries aimed at was to re-Christianize the nation, to return Dutch society to its orthodox Protestant roots. His arch-enemies, more than the Catholics, who were at least believers in God, were the liberals, who had dominated politics since the 1840s. Also, like the American Christians, and unlike French reactionaries, he believed in democracy. Since he had to accept with a certain reluctance that Catholics, socialists, and liberals shared his nationality, it was impossible to impose his Christian vision on everybody. The solution was not to separate religious belief from political argument or cut off religion from the public sphere, but to divide the public sphere up into autonomous pillars. This was designed to protect religion from the state. The Orthodox Protestants would have their own schools, universities, sports clubs, newspapers, pension funds, and political parties, and so would the Catholics, the socialists, and even the liberals. People would vote not according to their interests, but their deepest beliefs, which were, in the case of pious Christians, held to be the same thing. And this is not just history. Well, I suppose it is history. I'm old enough now to think of that. I mean, when I was a child, this was still very much the situation. It only rarely changed with the social revolution in the 1960s. I remember, if you were foolish enough to switch on the radio on Sundays, you heard nothing but sermons. I also was told by my father that when he was a child, it was perfectly normal for a Protestant minister in church on Sundays, though not my grandfather, because, as I said, he was a liberal ecumenical minister. But it was perfectly normal for Protestant ministers to tell their flock not to go and shop in particular department stores because they were owned by Catholics. This, as I say, really only changed in the 1960s, and remnants of it are still there. The anti-revolutionary party has been taken over by the Christian Democrat Party, but I still remember it well. So the divide between Europe and the United States may not be so wide after all. It would be more accurate to see the relations between politics and faith in America as just another variation in a varied Western world. Political problems concerning religion in Europe and the United States seem so distinct that it's easy to miss the considerable differences amongst European nations. The rise of the Christian right in the United States, as well as the various responses to Islam in Europe, reflect earlier social changes, especially those that came from the cultural turbulence of the 1960s. All have to do with the question of national identity, just as was true in the revolutionary 1790s, the anti-revolutionary 1860s, or the revolutionary 1930s. Religious or indeed secularist zealots like to fix or freeze collective identities in terms of revealed, unalterable orthodoxies, but faith, culture, or race. In reality, who or what we think we are is always much more fluid. In the 1960s, youth rebellion in Britain was largely about class and the national institutions designed to preserve a system based on it. As with all youth rebellions, sex played a large part. The trial surrounding the publication of D.H. Lawrence's Lady Chatterley's Lover is often thought to have kicked off the 1960s in England. As Philip Larkin wrote in his famous poem, sexual intercourse began in 1963, which was rather late for me, between the end of the Chatterley ban and the Beatles' first LP. What shocked British conservatives was not sodomy per se, a not uncommon practice, one presumes, in some of the better private schools, but the fact that it was performed by a common gardener on a lady. In France, it was the stifling atmosphere of Gaullist government, authoritarianism in French universities, and the lingering influence of petit bourgeois Catholic morals that sparked the student riots in May 1968. In the United States, patriotism, especially the notion of America's destiny to free the world by force of arms, this time in Vietnam, was a major issue. Hence the ostentatious flag burning on campuses and rock and roll stages, even as British rockers, in a gentler spirit of mockery, wrapped themselves in the Union Jack. But the main thing was race in the United States, and this was linked to sex and to religion. Black Panthers used the sexual swagger caricatured in white racist mythology to their own advantage. The rhetoric of the Reverend Martin Luther King owed a great deal to religious traditions, especially the social gospel preaching of black Baptist churches and the teachings of Mahatma Gandhi. But he was also influenced by Reinhold Niebuhr's criticisms of capitalism. King used the pulpit to say what young dropouts, mostly from the prosperous middle class, were also saying. This is King. Automobiles and subways, television and radios, dollars and cents can never be substitutes for God. King's social gospel was not just a product of the black churches, but part of a tradition that had never quite gone away in America since the late 19th century, when the Baptist minister Walter Rauschenbusch, among others, preached against the evils of Gilded Age capitalist greed. His was the other Christian voice, which grew fainter over time, outgunned by louder voices preaching the gospel of wealth. King, Abernathy, and their brothers-in-arms revived this tradition to promote racial equality. Andrew Young said, "Ours was an evangelical freedom movement that identified salvation with not just one's personal relationship with God, but a new relationship between people black and white." When this fine ideal ran into hard barriers of prejudice, often bolstered by references to the scriptures, especially in the South, some black activists turned to Islam for solace and a sense of self-respect. One thing most rebellions of the 1960s have in common, however, whether in Europe or the United States, is the perception of those who opposed them that they were a metropolitan, elitist attack on the values of the ordinary small-town folks rooted in the native soil, the little people championed by a long line of populists, fascists, and religious zealots, from Abraham Kuyper to, as it were, Elmer Gantry. Special riot police from the provinces were bussed into Paris in 1968 to teach the big city students a lesson. The provos of Amsterdam, with their long hair and white jeans, were mainly a provocation to the provincials who'd never liked Amsterdam anyway. Hippies, yippies, and other counterculturalists were based mainly in San Francisco, New York, Los Angeles, and the university towns. The man who shoots the hippie biker Billy, played by Dennis Hopper, at the end of Easy Rider is not a greedy capitalist, but a God-fearing yokel in a pickup truck from the heart of Louisiana. When the backlash against social change came, sooner in some countries than others, it came as a populist reaction against the elites. Because it had been an elite project since the end of World War II, gradually but inexorably, to replace national with European allegiances, first the French, then the Dutch, and finally the Irish, voted in referendums against the European Constitution. The European Constitution, by the way, which nobody read, it's an unreadable document, and the no vote had nothing really to do with the Constitution. It was very much an expression of distrust of the elites who were seen as betrayers, as a sort of trahison d'éclair. A massive increase of immigrants in many parts of Europe, too, came to be seen as a betrayal of the common man by the political and intellectual elites. Refugees, guest workers, and former colonial subjects were not only admitted into European countries in substantial numbers, without many questions asked, but their cultural differences had to be protected, even celebrated. And so, like Europe, multiculturalism became a dirty word, a symbol of a new kind of trahison d'éclair. The fear of Islam certainly plays a part in this increasingly sour mood about non-Western immigration in Europe. What drives it mostly is a general anxiety about losing one's bearings in a fluid and bewildering world of mass migrations, multinational corporations, and pan-national bureaucracies, a world that seems to favor only the elites. Religion, so far, has not really been part of the populist backlash anywhere in Europe, not even in Berlusconi's Italy. Because Europeans fought religious institutions for more than 200 years in the name of freedom, a struggle for liberty against Muslim believers cannot be couched plausibly in religious terms. It would seem like a contradiction. And yet there is a religious, even apocalyptic undertone in some of the anti-Muslim rhetoric, an accusation that secular Europeans are bound to lose an existential war because they no longer believe in values, have become decadent and nihilistic, are indeed, in this respect, inferior to the Muslims who have the benefit of their faith. In the United States, the struggle for freedom and civil rights was fought in the name of God. And so is the counter-revolution, which began already in the early 1970s, when white Southern Baptists, shocked by the emancipation of blacks, scrambled to the safety of large suburban churches and deserted the Democratic Party. The message they heard in their churches was an increasingly fundamentalist one. American identity had to be reasserted and taken back from the hands of effete, godless urban elites who had done their best to destroy it. A vital part of this American identity is the notion of being free, the freest people on earth, free from big government, free to carry arms, free from foreign attack. Freedom, religion, and America, in the eyes of the many fearful Christians, go together. We are at war with terror. If left to the secular liberals, this war will be lost and the apocalypse will come. Again, the gulf between Europe and the United States is not as wide as might be presumed. Similar fears haunt anxious minds. Everywhere, identities are thought to be at stake. Our histories are not the same. We have different notions of who we are. But everywhere, people are trying to cope with the confusion of a fast-changing world by reaching for fixed identities, whether based on race, religion, or national culture. This attempt to freeze ourselves into place is a deliberate challenge to liberal society. Perhaps it's a necessary corrective to the complacency of educated elites. The liberal virtues are sometimes taken too much for granted, and the needs for faith and belonging too quickly dismissed. Striking a balance between these needs and those virtues is part of a struggle that is as endless as it is essential. For what or who we are can never be fixed forever. That is one of the few things we can take to be absolutely true. Thank you. Please feel free to shoot. I just see people rushing to the door. There must be some disagreement in the hall, isn't there? Here, there's some.
I don't need to use the mic. Can you speak a little bit about the interplay of religion and the media?
The question is, can I say something about the interplay between religion and the media?
Yes, sir.
Oh, that's a very broad question. Well, I don't know about the interplay of religion in the media. I think that the media has played a very large role in the tensions that have come out of, in Europe at least, of the question of immigrants and especially Muslim immigrants. And I think even though the populist or the popular feeling of anxiety and hostility towards immigrants and Muslims is real enough and therefore easy to exploit by politicians, there is also a danger that intellectual debates are given more importance than they actually merit, in the sense that the same debate that you find in the United States between secularists and multiculturalists, the secularists accusing the multiculturalists of being appeasers, of being traitors to Enlightenment values, to being soft on Islam and so on. You hear that in Europe too, and that if we don't stand up to Islam, then Europe will become Islamized and it'll become Eurabia, and those sort of things are frequently voiced in newspaper columns and forums of debate. But what is missed, I think, is that, especially by these people who've very rarely set foot in immigrant areas, that actually, despite all the tensions and despite the very real threat of violent revolutionary Islamic extremism, that integration is taking place. And if you go to a French hospital, you'll find that half the doctors are Muslims of a colonial background. If you look at the law department of Dutch universities, you'll find that half the students are not only Muslims, but they're women, and often fairly orthodox Muslims. And so you have law students in headscarves trying to combine their faith, sometimes an orthodox faith, with enough participation in democratic society in order to want to learn the law. And one of the reasons that women are so prominent now as in universities is that it's the one way they can get away from parental control. So I think even though we read about all the tensions and all the problems and so on, actually there are other trends that are going on that are rather buried by people who have a big voice in the media. And I'm not sure that answers your question particularly, but it's one answer at least.
One of the issues between secularists and multiculturalists in Europe is the question of the status of women and the equality of women. I wonder what your thoughts are about that.
Yes, I mean, and that's it's a tricky question, and of course it's symbolized in many respects by the debates over the headscarves. And I think it's tricky because on the one hand, I mean, those who are very much opposed to the influence of Islam or afraid of the influence of Islam say that they're standing up for the liberty of young women to be free to make their own choices and so on. And I think it's a mistake to be dogmatic on this issue because women wear headscarves for many different reasons. And there are clearly cases where women are coerced, young women, by their fathers, their brothers, to wear a headscarf, even if they may not wish to. I mean, you can actually see this in the streets of many European cities of women sort of taking their headscarves off when they're not seen and putting them back on when they go home. Sometimes in the banlieue in France, for example, women do it because if they don't, they're an easier target for male violence. On the other hand, there are also women, and very educated women, who wear the headscarf out of personal choice, even when their mothers or their sisters are not doing so, as a sort of form of asserting their identity, sometimes as a protest against what they see as a hostile majority. And so I think one should be very careful not to be rigid about this. And I think that's true of all opinions that, from a liberal point of view, one might consider to be less than desirable. I myself have been accused by some of being tolerant towards intolerance. And my answer to that would be that I am prepared to be tolerant towards intolerance as long as the intolerance is only a question of opinion. As soon as an intolerant opinion is imposed on others by violence or the threat of violence, then I think the state should crack down. But I would be very wary of giving the state a kind of or handing the state the authority to intervene simply where it's a matter of opinions, because after all we tolerate all kinds of opinions in an open and pluralist society, even when they're intolerant if we don't like them. And I don't think that just the fact that somebody has views that we would not approve of as liberals, of homosexuals or the role of women, for example, should not mean that we feel that the state should get actively involved in cracking down on such views. Now, one might say in education more effort should be made to try and minimize such views or to argue against them and so on, and I wouldn't be against that. But I think that there is a danger with the secularists who stand up for Enlightenment values and so on to have a kind of intolerance of their own. There is a, I think, oh, I'm getting things muddled up now.
This country has been remarkably successful at integrating Muslim immigrants compared to, I would say, a conspicuous lack of success in Europe. Do you think that is owing to the fact that here there is very little in terms of welfare programs for immigrants, and that therefore integration with the broader society is actually an economic imperative for survival, whereas enormous handouts from the welfare state allow people to remain in ghettos without having to mix and mingle with the broader population?
Yes, I think that is one factor. Whether that means that the Europeans should simply dismantle their welfare states, I mean, I don't think that that's necessarily the answer either, but I think it's definitely a factor. But it's not entirely true that immigration has been a conspicuous failure. I mean, it depends on who one's talking about. Nobody has a problem with Chinese immigrants and even black immigrants from the former colonies in Britain or Holland, although not without problems, has certainly not been a total failure, partly because the West Indians in Britain and the Surinamese in the Netherlands share broadly a kind of working class culture with the local population. I mean, they're good at football, they drink beer, they like to smoke a joint, they listen to the same kind of music. I mean, they're not. And again, the Indian Hindu immigrants in Britain, again, have been remarkably successful. There is, I think, a greater problem with Muslims, and I think for various reasons, and a greater problem than in the United States. Various reasons. One is that in America, most people from the Middle East, many of them are Christians, of course, but most of them are educated and middle class, or more than middle class, I mean, especially in the case of Iranians. This is not true in Europe with the Gastarbeiter, who, of course, were often illiterate from village societies. And even you see this difference in the US of the different waves of Indo-Chinese immigrants, that those who came from villages had a harder time than those who came from Saigon and were well educated and so on. The other difference is that aside from a place like Dearborn, Michigan possibly, that Muslim immigrants are not a conspicuous presence in America. I mean, they're just one group among many others. In European countries, they're the vast majority, and suddenly in towns like Amsterdam or Paris is one thing, but in provincial towns, suddenly areas where you never really saw non-Western immigrants are now full of people with beards and headscarves who are very conspicuous, which makes it harder. The other reason is that a question of self-definition. The Americans have fairly, I mean, as you know, the cliche about the nation of immigrants, but it has a fairly political sense of self-definition. If you're an American citizen, whatever cultural habits you may have or whatever you wish to wear on your head, if you are loyal to the Constitution and you know you're a good citizen, and you can have another culture, but still be seen as a citizen, whereas European countries Europeans still have a more cultural and historical idea of themselves. And European societies, especially rather small ones like the Dutch one, for example, are a little bit like clubs, where the members know the unspoken rules, which doesn't mean that they beat up non-members, but it's harder for non-members to be accepted as full members because they don't really know the unspoken rules. And so that also makes it harder. So I think the economic factor that you mention, I think, is a factor. It's not the only factor.
Hi, yeah, sorry. And going off your previous talk about what sort of tendency of some liberals to engage in a sort of intolerance of intolerance, I was wondering if you could say something about back when Jörg Haider was elected governor of Carinthia, and there was a sort of backlash to sort of isolate Austria, and what I would see as an element of hypocrisy to all of that, which is, I guess is what you're saying. I was wondering if you could just talk about that.
I didn't
briefly.
quite get the question, I'm sorry.
What you would say about the backlash against Austria in the 90s when Jörg Haider was elected governor of a state in southern Austria.
The backlash against Austria from the EU, you mean?
That's what I understood,
yes.
Yeah.
No, I was opposed to that at the time, because I didn't like Jörg Haider, and I certainly didn't like what he stood for, but he was democratically elected, and I think it was rather hypocritical of other European countries to ostracize the Austrians because a legitimate party had been legitimately elected. And what they should have done is to wait and see what they did in government. And if they did something that was clearly undemocratic, that is the time to do something, but not simply because you don't like the guy who was elected. I mean, I think this is a flaw in many policies. If you're serious about democracy, then you have to go a long way to abide by the choice of people who have elected their governments. I mean, I'm not an expert on Algeria, but it's instinctively I felt when the Algerians elected an Islamist party for reasons often that had nothing to do with religious zealotry. It had to do with corruption of the secular dictatorship and so on. I think it was a big mistake of the French in particular to support a military coup against them, because if you drive a party like that underground, you have a larger chance of serious political violence than if you allow them to govern, which usually has a tempering effect. No, not always, but that is. So I think, in short, I thought it was foolish of the EU.
The importance of the force of identity, and yet with Europe marching in the direction of the European Union, there is invariably a blurring of identity. How does this play?
Yes, no, there is a blurring of identity, but as I said in the talk, it's the real who feels most European, who is benefiting most from this new world, which is it's a gradual process, and in the end, maybe in another 50, 60 years, most people will feel European first and then something more local. But so far, I mean, the people who are truly sort of operating on a pan-European level, well, soccer stars, people who French soccer players who play for clubs in London or Madrid or Milan, who often, except for the Brits, who often speak at least 2 or 3 languages, they are part of a real pan-European elite. People in finance and business. French people young people who move to London to work in the city and so on. These people are already benefiting from a kind of borderless Europe. But there are a lot of people who feel left behind by all this, who cannot escape from their local conditions and feel aggrieved when the political and social elites look down on them for wanting to assert their national feeling more than the European one. They're often, I mean, this is now changed because there is a real backlash, but until about 10 years ago, certainly, in a country like the Netherlands, if you had any kind of skepticism towards the European project, you were more or less dismissed as a bigot, if not a racist. And so there is a class element in this, which is often overlooked. And I think the elites often overlook it at their peril. It's not a healthy situation that the only place that you can assert sort of national feeling is in the football stadium. And that has so far been the case. So, one more over there, maybe.
My question is related to moral election. Why voters in original sin, or people would say, God always, I will cry. Psychiatrist said that 90% of my clients in the last week are about to lose. Now, so my question is, what or buried it in politics?
Yes, I wouldn't disagree with that. I mean, of course, in a presidential system like the American one, you're anointing a king as much as electing a political leader. And so there is a lot of irrational, quasi-religious feeling invested in that. But I should say that these feelings are shared by most Europeans. If anything, they feel even more passionately about Obama than the Americans do. And I say that half jokingly, but I think that there is a reason for it, which is that it's become very popular amongst European pundits and commentators and so on in the Bush years, but with a certain element of Schadenfreude, to wallow in American misfortunes and disasters and write America off. The country, America is finished. Nobody looks up to America anymore. The American age is over, etc., etc. Some with Schadenfreude, others who say it in sorrow because we grew up looking at America as this place where things were possible that were not yet possible in other parts of the world. It was a place where, with all its flaws, it represented a certain hope. And I think in some ways Obama, or the candidacy of Obama, has revived that feeling, in that all Europeans know very well that a black person, especially a black person with a middle name Hussein, could never be elected to that kind of office in any European country so far, let alone in many other countries. And so I think it sort of revived this, on one hand, a kind of nostalgia for the days that people looked at America with hope, and another, if that doesn't sound too contradictory, another had a kind of hope that maybe America could play that role again. Because with all the talk of China and India and Russia being the sort of new powers and so on, very few Europeans and many non-Europeans in their hearts rarely think it would be preferable to be bossed around by the Chinese or the Russians compared to the Americans. And so, but it was very difficult to have those kind of feelings while George W. Bush was in power. But I think Obama is an inspirational figure in that sense. And rightly or wrongly, and maybe it's very sentimental, but I think a lot of people do kind of see him as an American Mandela. And that's why people will cry if he loses, including me.